The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you. Patrick was born toward the close of the 4th century into a household where the name of God had already been honored for generations. His father, Calpurnius, was a man of British race but Roman by citizenship, holding the rank of decurion, a civic leader under Roman law. His lineage carried weight, discipline, and responsibility. Even more importantly, it carried faith. Calpurnius himself was a Christian, as had been his father Potitus and his grandfather Odysseus, men who had held firmly to Christ long before Patrick ever drew breath. The faith had not arrived suddenly in Patrick's home. It had been planted, watered, and preserved across generations. Patrick's mother, Conchessa, was a woman of deep wisdom and devotion, closely related to the great Saint Martin of Tours. From her, Patrick learned gentleness, prayer, and reverence for God. She labored intentionally to raise her children in the fear and love of the Lord, believing that faith was not merely taught in words, but formed through daily life. Patrick grew up not as a pampered noble, but as a child shaped by discipline, simplicity, and reverence. Though he was the son of a Roman citizen and British noble, his upbringing was restrained, grounded, and purposeful. According to Roman custom, Patrick was given 3 names: Patricius, Magonus, and Sacatus. Patricius spoke of nobility, Magonus reflected family heritage, and Sacatus, a Celtic name, meant valiant in war. Though he did not yet know it, that name would prove prophetic. Patrick had a brother named Sanon and 5 sisters, all of whom would later dedicate themselves to God and the work of the church. Faith was not a solitary calling in this family. It was a shared inheritance. From his earliest years, unusual signs followed Patrick's life. When the time came for his baptism, no priest could be found. His parents brought him instead to a blind hermit named Gornius. There was no water available for the rite, yet Gornius acted in faith. Taking the infant's hand, he traced the sign of the cross upon the ground. Immediately, water burst forth from the earth. Gornius washed his own eyes and received his sight, and then baptized the child. From that moment, Patrick's life seemed marked by divine intervention. As a child, Patrick showed an unusual awareness of God. Later in his writings, he would testify that God had been watching over him long before he himself understood good and evil. He would say that God strengthened him and comforted him as a father comforts a son. Even in ignorance, heaven had already claimed him. Patrick was fostered according to the customs of ancient Ireland, raised for a time by careful, hard-working people who lived simply, tending flocks and herds. There, among ordinary labor and quiet routines, the extraordinary power of God began to manifest. One winter day, Patrick gathered icicles and carried them proudly to his foster mother, believing he had brought her something of value. She rebuked him and told him wood would have been better. Patrick smiled and told her to trust God. Moments later, the icicles ignited into a roaring fire on the hearth. Wonder filled the house, and fear followed close behind. Another time, while tending sheep with his little sister Lupita, she fell and struck her head on a stone. When Patrick returned and found her unconscious, he prayed over her. Instantly she was healed. Only a faint scar remained as testimony to what God had done. They returned home as if nothing unusual had occurred, but heaven had already declared its power through the boy. On another occasion, Patrick's foster father collapsed and died suddenly during a gathering. Grief overtook the people. His foster mother cried out, accusing Patrick of allowing the man's death. Patrick ran to the body, wrapped his arm around the dead man's neck, and spoke tenderly, calling him to rise and return home. Before the astonished crowd, the man stood up and walked away. Fear and awe followed Patrick wherever he went, yet Patrick himself did not see these signs as evidence of his own greatness. He remained humble, unaware that his life was being prepared for trials far beyond childhood wonder. When he was 16 years old, everything changed. Raiders from the north swept across the coast, plundering towns and taking captives. One of their kings was Niall of the 9 hostages. During one of these raids, Patrick was seized, torn from his family, and carried across the sea to Ireland. He was sold as a slave to a petty king named Milcho. Patrick was placed over swine, isolated in the fields, exposed to cold, hunger, and loneliness. But it was there, far from home, stripped of comfort and status, that God became real to him. Scripture learned in childhood flooded his heart. Prayer became his lifeline. Faith moved from inheritance to experience. Patrick later said that in those lonely fields, his unbelief was broken, and he was truly converted. He prayed, constantly, day and night, in snow and rain, and God met him. Milcho noticed something different about the young slave. Though a druid and enemy of Christianity, Milcho asked Patrick to teach his children to read. Patrick spoke often with an angel named Victor, whom he would later call the Angel of Ireland. After 6 years of slavery, Victor appeared to him one night and told him that his ship was ready. Trusting God, Patrick escaped, traveled to the coast, and after many hardships, returned home. Though his parents had died, his relatives welcomed him. Yet his story was not finished. One night, Victor appeared again, holding letters. One was placed into Patrick's hands. It was titled, "The Voice of the Irish." Patrick heard voices calling him back to Ireland. He knew then that the land of his suffering would become the land of his calling. Patrick sought ordination, eventually being commissioned to return to Ireland. When he arrived in the year 432, he came not as a slave, but as a servant of the Most High God. Opposition awaited him. Druids, kings, and magicians resisted him fiercely. But Patrick believed that if kings could be won, nations would follow. Soon, fires would blaze on forbidden hills. Idols would fall, the dead would rise, storms would obey prayer, and Ireland would encounter the living God through the obedience of one man. When Patrick returned to Ireland in the year 432, he did not arrive as a conqueror or a man seeking honor. He returned as one under divine command, carrying the gospel into a land gripped by fear, superstition, and the authority of druids. He understood the structure of Irish society and believed that if the kings could be reached, the people would follow. His mission was not to destroy Ireland, but to redeem it. Patrick's first great confrontation with the spiritual powers of the land came during the season of Easter. The High King of Ireland, Leghair, son of Niall of the 9 hostages, had summoned the sub-kings, nobles, bards, and druids to Tara for the festival. According to the ancient law, no fire was to be lit anywhere in the land until the chief druid had kindled the ceremonial flame on the royal hill. The law was strict, and the penalty for disobedience was death. Patrick and his companions travelled to the Hill of Slane, overlooking the River Boyne. As evening fell, Patrick prepared to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. He knew the law, but he also knew the command of God. As darkness covered the land, Patrick lit the Paschal fire. The flames rose into the night sky, bright and unashamed. It was the first Easter fire lit in Ireland, and Patrick declared that it would never be extinguished. From the hill of Tara, the king and his druids saw the blaze. While Tara remained in darkness, the plain below was illuminated. Rage filled the king's heart. The druids, trembling, told him that if the fire was not quenched that night, it would never be quenched, and the man who lit it would overthrow the kings and destroy their idols. Leghair swore that Patrick would die. 9 chariots thundered toward Slane under the cover of darkness. Warriors stood ready, shields raised, spears gleaming in the firelight. The king refused to rise to greet Patrick, violating Irish custom to assert dominance. A messenger was sent to summon him. Soon, Patrick and his companions descended the hill, singing psalms. His voice rang clearly through the night, declaring trust in the name of the Lord, rather than in horses or chariots. As Patrick approached, fear fell upon the warriors. One man, Erk, son of Deg, rose to greet him. In that moment, faith entered his heart. Patrick blessed him, and Erk would later become the first bishop of Slane. Patrick prophesied that his city would be noble and enduring. The druids erupted in fury. One of them, Lochru, attacked Patrick with blasphemy and rage, mocking the Holy Trinity. Patrick, filled with righteous authority, called upon God to judge the blasphemer. Immediately, Lochru was lifted into the air by an unseen force and dashed to the ground, dead before all. Terror seized the people. They saw that the power with Patrick was greater than the power they served. The king ordered Patrick's death, but Patrick stood unmoved. He called upon God, and the earth shook. Darkness covered the sky. Horses bolted in fear, warriors fled, and the wind roared through the valley. Only the king and a few remained. The queen approached Patrick with humility, pleading for mercy. Though the king knelt, his submission was false, born of fear rather than faith. Leghair invited Patrick to Tara, plotting to kill him on the way. Ambushes were prepared along the road, but God revealed the plan to Patrick. As Patrick and his companions traveled, they were hidden by divine power. Those watching saw only deer and a fawn pass by. From this miracle, Patrick composed the hymn later known as The Deer's Cry, declaring Christ as his shield and protector. At Tara, Patrick faced poisoned cups, dark sorcery, and direct challenges to the power of God. He blessed what he ate and drank, and the poison had no effect. The king demanded a contest between Patrick and the druids. Snow was summoned by sorcery, and Patrick, by prayer, caused it to vanish. Darkness was called down, and Patrick dispelled it in the name of Christ. When books were proposed to be cast into water and fire, the druids refused, knowing their defeat. Finally, 2 huts were built and set ablaze. Patrick entered one unharmed. The druid entered the other and perished in the flames. The king was shaken. Though he never truly converted, he granted protection to the Christians. That day, thousands believed and were baptized. The idols of Ireland began to fall, not by violence, but by the authority of God. Patrick moved onward, preaching in villages and cities. Near Dublin, then a small settlement, he encountered a people crushed by grief. The king's 2 children lay dead. Patrick prayed, and God raised them both. The king and his people turned from idols and were baptized. Churches were built, the poor were cared for, and the gospel spread rapidly. Patrick traveled tirelessly, facing opposition from druids and kings alike. On one occasion, 2 daughters of a king approached him at a fountain. Patrick preached to them about the Creator of heaven and earth. Their hearts burned with faith. He baptized them, and though they soon died, their salvation testified to God's mercy. Druids confronted Patrick, but through patient preaching, even they were converted. Patrick withdrew to a mountain in Mayo, fasting and praying for 40 days. Demons surrounded him, shrieking like black birds. Patrick sang psalms until finally he commanded them to leave. Angels appeared, and God granted Patrick sweeping promises for Ireland, that every man, woman, and child would hear the gospel, and that invaders would not prevail. Patrick returned again and again to the people, preaching, baptizing, ordaining, healing, and delivering. He rebuked kings, destroyed idols, and established churches. He ordained hundreds of bishops and thousands of priests, not by human ambition, but by obedience to God. As his life drew to a close, Patrick longed to die in Armagh, but God directed him instead to Saul. There, after receiving communion, he gave thanks, prayed, and surrendered his spirit. Angels were said to surround his body for 12 nights. Before his death, Patrick confessed that anything good done through him was the gift of God alone. Ireland had been changed forever, not by Patrick's strength, but by the power of the God he served. Patrick's later years were marked not by rest, but by relentless labor. Age did not soften his resolve or diminish his obedience. Though his body bore the marks of fasting, travel, exposure, and conflict, his spirit remained unyielding. He moved from kingdom to kingdom, often unwelcomed, frequently threatened, yet always confident that the authority behind him was greater than any king or druid. Where Patrick went, idols fell, not always physically, but in the hearts of the people. He preached Christ crucified and risen, not as philosophy, but as living power. He spoke of a God who ruled the heavens and the seas, who commanded the sun and stars, and who revealed himself fully in Jesus Christ. Many who listened had lived in fear of spirits, omens, and curses all their lives. Through Patrick's preaching and prayer, fear loosened its grip, and faith took root. In many places, druids rose against him publicly, attempting to discredit him before the people. They accused him of sorcery, of deception, of bringing foreign gods into the land. Patrick did not answer with insults or violence. He answered with truth, prayer, and signs that no argument could silence. The sick were healed, the possessed were delivered, and the dead were raised. What the druids could not imitate, they could not withstand. Patrick often traveled with a small band of companions, young clerics he trained personally. Among them was Benignus, who rarely left Patrick's territoire. Patrick did not merely preach, he fathered a generation. He taught them to pray through the night, to fast willingly, to forgive their enemies, and to trust God even when surrounded by danger. He told them that obedience mattered more than survival, and that faithfulness was greater than success. At times, Patrick wept for the people. He wept for kings hardened by pride, for villages bound by superstition, for children offered to idols, and for souls lost without hope. He carried Ireland in his prayers constantly. Often, he withdrew alone to desolate places where he would pour out his heart to God. It was said that the ground where Patrick prayed became holy, soaked with tears and intercession. God continued to answer Patrick's prayers with unmistakable power. When hostile tribes planned ambushes, Patrick was warned in advance. When famine threatened regions newly converted, provision came. When disease spread, Patrick prayed, and healing followed. These miracles were not performed for spectacle. They flowed naturally from a life surrendered fully to God. Though thousands believed, opposition never fully ceased. Some kings pretended submission to avoid conflict, yet secretly maintained their idols. Patrick confronted them boldly. He rebuked injustice, exposed corruption, and warned rulers that their authority was temporary. But God's judgment was eternal. Many kings resented him for this, but they feared him more. They had seen too much to dismiss him as a mere man. Patrick's authority did not come from Rome, rank, or lineage. It came from intimacy with God. Even his enemies acknowledged that there was something different about him. He did not seek wealth, women, or power. He lived simply, often giving away gifts meant for him to the poor. He slept little, prayed much, and carried no bitterness toward those who persecuted him. As the years passed, churches multiplied across Ireland. Monasteries were founded, bishops were ordained. Patrick ensured that the faith would not depend on him alone. He established order, teaching doctrine carefully so that the gospel would endure long after his death. He warned against blending Christianity with pagan practice and insisted that Christ alone must be worshipped. Patrick never forgot that he had once been a slave. That memory shaped his compassion. He advocated for captives, slaves, and the poor. He challenged the powerful to see the value of every soul. He saw himself not as Ireland's master, but as its servant. Toward the end of his life, Patrick sensed that his time was drawing near. Like many of the Celtic saints, he seemed to know when death approached. He desired to die in Armagh, the place most associated with his ministry. But the angel Victor appeared and instructed him otherwise. Patrick was told to return to Saul, to the place where his mission in Ireland had begun. Obedient even in death, Patrick returned to Dichu's barn near Strangford Lough. There, surrounded by brethren, he gave thanks to God for every deliverance, every soul saved, every mercy received. He received Holy Communion from Bishop Tassach, prayed with those present, and quietly surrendered his spirit to God. It was said that for 12 nights following his death, a radiant light surrounded his body, as though heaven itself bore witness to the life that had been lived. Word spread quickly, and grief filled the land. The man who had once been a slave had become a spiritual father to a nation. Before his death, Patrick made a final confession. He declared himself a sinner, saved only by grace. He denied any personal glory and attributed every good work to God alone. He prayed that if God willed, he might even shed his blood for Christ, counting it joy to suffer for the name he loved. Patrick died on the 17th day of March in the year 571. But death did not silence his voice. His prayers continued to echo through Ireland. His teachings shaped generations. His obedience altered the course of a nation. He had founded countless churches, ordained hundreds of bishops, and commissioned thousands of ministers. He had confronted kings, defeated sorcery, raised the dead, and endured suffering without bitterness. Yet Patrick's greatest legacy was not miracles or institutions. It was faithfulness. Ireland was never the same again. The land once ruled by fear became known as a land of saints and scholars. The gospel that Patrick preached spread far beyond Ireland's shores, carried by missionaries who would later transform Europe. Patrick's life stood as proof that God delights in using the weak, the broken, and the obedient. A kidnapped teenager became an apostle. A slave became a father. A sinner became a servant through whom God revealed his power. And so the story of Patrick remains, not as a legend of human greatness, but as a testimony to what God can do through one life fully surrendered.